President, if I may.
Mr. Flanagan.
Okay. The governor came out with a budget proposal that has been modified in a number of different ways, and I think it's very important to talk about where we started from and where we've ended up, and where, frankly, we might be going as well. When the governor came out, everybody talked about, including us, the Assembly, and the governor, about a $1.5 billion cut, approximately, in state aid to education. The school aid runs that we see here and the final agreement that has been reached has been modified in a number of different ways, most notable of which is last year there was $600 million that came from the federal government, as you well know, called EduJobs funding. That was a one-shot source of revenue that was similar but separate to the ARA money that we had gotten to help offset some of the problems in the prior budgets. That money from the last 2 years was not considered as part of the base or as part of the school aid run. So in consultation with the Assembly and the governor, we have taken that out of the run because it's a one-shot source of revenue, and frankly, it should not have been built into the base. Taking that into account, the governor's proposed year-to-year cut in state aid was $929 million. Based on the actions that we've taken, that has been reduced to $697 million. There are a couple of things in relation to that I think are very important, and while they're separate, they certainly are worthy of mention. All of our colleagues are well aware of some of the proposed cost shifts that were in the governor's budget. The 4201 schools to the tune of $98 million, summer school special education for $57 million, and the Office of Children and Family Services, while it's separate, it clearly affects school districts. That was about $37 million. So independent of anything we did relative to the school aid run, there was about $190 million in cost shifts that were avoided, that did not go back to the local property taxpayer, and the distribution of those funds is an important component of what we did. In relation to the proposal that the governor advanced, there were winners and there were losers. I would respectfully offer that working with the Assembly and with the executive, that we took a bad situation and we made it better. You know it's not perfect. I know it's not perfect. Certainly anybody who pays attention and does a fair assessment will have to recognize that we put money back in, and here's how we did it. And in fact, it ended up being very similar to what we had advanced in our One House resolution. There's $272 million in restorations in school aid. $57 million of that represents the cost of funding the summer school special education program that I had talked about. Approximately $161 million of that for this year's fiscal year makes up part of that balance. And the rest of the money is tied to things like teacher centers, libraries, non-public schools. So when you look on a direct year-to-year, meaning school year, restoration of money, it's $230 million that we drove back into the formula all across the state of New York. We achieved regional balance. Certainly coming from the county of Westchester, you can look at the runs and see restorations. I know Senator Stewart Cousins had spoken in detail, not only outside the chamber, but here today, in terms of some restorations that have been made. More money is driven to Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse, Yonkers, the city of New York, our rural districts, our suburban districts. So it's spread out, and you know how it works. You try and come up with a formula that provides some fairness and equity, and you push here, you prod there, and sometimes it works in one way. The final resolution, I think, is very similar to what we had advocated in our One House budget resolution. Now, I know, Senator Oppenheimer, you in particular have been acutely sensitive to the issue of the 4201 schools. I want to address that in particular. There are some who may walk out of here and think, well, wait a second, we haven't really appropriated money to address this problem. We have absolutely addressed the problem of the 4201 schools. In working with the executive, the school districts are going to pay the money in the first instance. They will get 50% of that money reimbursed during the 11-12 school year, and they will get the other 50% in the 12-13 school year. The reason there's no formal appropriation in here is because it's part of next year's fiscal year. So I'm representing, and you know this because everyone is aware of it, that is properly funded. It's taken out of the local school districts, taken the burden off their back, and while it is certainly not perfect. We have to work on that separately. It clearly is something that was very much a concern for a number of our colleagues in all communities across the state of New York. So I think, as I said, we took a bad situation and, frankly, we made it better.
Senator Oppenheimer?
Thank you, Senator. I would like to add on that particular issue, if I can ask another question. While the payment will come this year, at least, not on the formula for the first half of the year, the second half is on the formula, and do you believe that in future years it will be on the formula so that the school districts will themselves be paying the full amount for and getting reimbursed, maybe 50%, maybe more, over the course of the year for their payment to send that child to the 4201?
I would differentiate and disagree to an extent. I don't believe the second year is on the formula. I think I'm making a fair representation that, in essence, what we did was we had a $98 million problem. And there are those who will say, well, why wasn't it the same way? The bottom line is, if we wanted to come up with additional money to drive to our school districts, we had to find a way to perhaps do this creatively, maybe finesse it a little bit. But the bottom line, again, is that these schools are going to be made whole. And I think this gives us an opportunity and a window to work with all the stakeholders, the schools, the regents, the state education department, the division of the budget, because Senator Oppenheimer, you know this as well as I do. There isn't really anybody who's hugely happy with how the program was working in terms of its financing long before the governor's proposal. This, in a perverse way, may provide a window for people who are, frankly, of good faith and are willing to compromise and negotiate to sit down and come up with something that I hope will continue to be a direct state appropriation, but work out the details in terms of the financing and the methodology so the kids, who are supposed to be our ultimate and primary concern, are properly taken care of, and these schools don't have to worry about whether or not they're going to have the cash to meet their bills.
I appreciate your answer, but I'd like to pursue one more question on this subject.
Sure. An additional question by Senator Oppenheimer. Senator Flanagan, do you yield?
I do.
Senator Oppenheimer.
When we talk about a rate methodology, though, it is frightening when you think of what has happened with the 853 schools and with the special act schools, where the rate methodology has been a catastrophe and they've had to be loaning money from the banks, and now the banks aren't even loaning to them. So do you feel that the rate methodology used on those other two special needs schools would be something that you would suggest for the 4201s?
I have no intent. In fact, I'm going to use it in a different direction. I think the example of the 853 schools is something that we should look at and say, we're not going to do that. We should be doing something different and better, and frankly, we need to include the 853 schools in that type of discussion. If you look, and it doesn't matter, it's me or anyone in this chamber, we talk about education. These are our frailest of children. Whether they have disabilities, whether they have learning problems, whether they have behavioral problems. If we're going to look in terms of how we're going to educate kids in the state of New York, there is no more acute area of need and sensitivity. So I don't think the 853 situation is working out the way it should either. But we are obviously in the throes of this budget. The governor did not make any proposed changes to the 853 schools, so we have to live within the confines and the structure of what he presented to us. Do I think it's worthy of discussion? Yes, and I think that's something that we can be doing right after we enact this budget.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to limit my questions. I'll probably only have a couple more. So would the senator still yield?
Senator yields.
As you know, in the past 2 years when I was chair of education, I did a lot of work around unfunded mandates and around sharing of services. Is there anything in this budget limiting or eliminating a number of unfunded mandates on localities, like consolidating transportation at schools or utilizing a single superintendent for several school districts? Is there anything in the budget which I haven't been able to read?
Senator Oppenheimer, I'd be happy to answer that question. Senator Oppenheimer, unfortunately, I have everyone cheering me on in the background here. To your point, This is Groundhog Day in a bad way. The Assembly has not advanced anything. I'm going to repeat, anything. Nothing meaningful, nothing substantive, nothing qualitative, nothing quantitative. They have not offered one approach whatsoever with regard to mandates. The governor, we had been working on language to do a direct ban on unfunded state mandates. The governor was on board. And we had discussions about not only doing that, but looking at a review of all existing mandates to see which ones worked and maybe where we should be picking up the cost. So there's a good faith effort, but I'm telling you something you already know, but it bears repeating. I will tell you, I have talked to many of my colleagues. This is an area of tremendous concern to all of us. We need to engage the Assembly, and you know what? There should be nothing wrong with having a debate on these issues. If it gets contentious and it gets a little out of hand at times, so be it. Everybody talks about it. You tried to advance it. We tried to advance it. We're trying to advance it now. I don't think I'm going out on the proverbial limb to suggest that you will be seeing in the coming weeks mandate relief proposals on the floor of this House that will address a myriad of concerns, not only in the area of education, but I know Senator Martin, Senator Little have been extremely active in putting together ideas for the body's consideration that I'm comfortable and confident that we will pass, and then we will have to, of course, send it over to the Assembly and see if they're willing to engage.
If he would yield for another question.
Senator yields.
I think I heard you say that teacher centers were going to be funded in this budget. They weren't funded last year. Prior year, they'd been funded at $35 million. But are they funded in this budget?
Oppenheimer funded. It is slightly over $14 million. I think it's
14.3.
Thank you. Senator Farley informs me it's $14.3 million.
Included, even if it's at half the amount. Now, if I could just look for a moment at libraries. I haven't had a chance to see how much they have been improved. They have such great need, and years ago, like 4, 5, 6 years ago, they were up at like $102 million, and we had them cut back to like $74 million. Do you know if they are improved in this current budget?
They are. There's $3 million added back, and I have checked with my resident ambassador to the library, Senator Farley. While they, like everyone else, would like more money, they are very gratified that $3 million was added back in the final budget.
And I'm trying to cut down my questions. I think my last question would center around BOCES. And does the budget eliminate BOCES aids to the local school districts for certain shared services which are now aidable? And the governor's suggestion was to remove that aid, which seemed so contrary to our idea of trying to promote shared services. I mean, they're the ultimate shared services for 64 years now. Do you know if aid has been put in?
Yeah, the governor had proposed 2 primary changes to BOCES. Fortunately, both of them were prospective, but regardless, we have rejected both of them. One is changing of the reimbursement methodology to go more tied to the foundation formula, which would have a beneficial effect on some districts, an adverse impact on others. Certainly, you're aware of that. We have rejected that, and we have rejected the governor's elimination of aid for approximately 25 different types of shared services. I'm going to take the governor at the good faith that they are really looking for ways to find efficiencies, promote consolidation, and that proposal didn't go that way. We have rejected it, but I think we can move forward in a way. And personally, I think we should be looking for ways to enhance the BOCES model by looking at the reimbursement, because if we're going to give incentives to school districts, the way we do it is through money.
Thank you, Senator Flanagan.